his affidavit, President Cyril Ramaphosa had said it would be a breach of his obligations to the International Criminal Court if he disclosed the details of the warrant of arrest. Ramaphosa said the DA would be aware of the confidentiality of interactions with the ICC. One of the parties in the case that joined the DA, well, let's put it differently, that went to court to try and get access to these documents is Media Monitoring Africa. Their director is William Bird. William, good afternoon to you. I presume you welcome today's judgment. Why did you join this case?
Good afternoon. Well, we joined as an amicus, so as a friend of the court, because fundamentally, as South Africa, we've got a very clear policy towards open justice and open access. You know, given our brutal past, it was really important, and our courts have followed this quite religiously, and they've developed some strong judgments dealing with the idea that the default should be open access to, justice. So we've seen our courts leading the world on access to criminal cases, for example, allowing media to broadcast from those as a default now. So we really have developed exceptional principles around that. At the same time, there is a clause in the Rome Statute that says, which is the statute effectively that deals with how we engage with the International Criminal Court, and that does require confidentiality. But our argument was to say what you need to do is balance the need for confidentiality and open justice. And that was effectively our submission. And in our submissions, we made the argument that because the Rome Statute has now been domesticated, because we signed and ratified it, it's subjected to our constitutional law. And because of that, you then have to make an argument that says if you're going to have confidentiality, it needs to be such that you balance it against the needs for open justice. And clearly, the court found favor with our view and have now made those affidavits all public.
In other words, from what you're saying, our Constitution still is more important than anything the International Criminal Court can bring to South Africa. If I've understood you correctly, our Constitution says open justice, therefore you can't have a confidential affidavit.
Well, our Constitution talks about that. It doesn't say there are no circumstances where you shouldn't have things confidential. Obviously, cases of children are an obvious example. But because we've ratified that law, it now is subject, like any other law, to the principles of our Constitution. And so the court had to balance that and say, well, yes, the Rome Statute does talk about this, but we have a basic default principle that talks about access to justice, and unless there are compelling reasons for why this should be confidential, then, open justice would trump that. And indeed, this is the case now.
I could imagine a president or a government making this argument that, for example, you want to sign a treaty with a country, you want to bring an end to some kind of conflict. And because of what would be described as domestic political reasons, think of China and the United States trying to come to some agreement, for example. Imagine the pressure the United States delegation would be under from their voters. China would probably find it much easier to negotiate. So the argument would go, the president or the government would say, it's much easier if these negotiations or this correspondence remain confidential. And that would actually be in the national interest. Sometimes, William, it's impossible to negotiate in public. Would you ever buy an argument like that?
Yeah, completely, and the courts, and certainly our arguments allowed for the fact that there may well be instances, and we have not had sight of the affidavits. It was entirely in the hands of the court to say, you know what, we've considered this principle of open justice, but it is in our view in the interest of justice and, reasonableness that we limit open justice. You can imagine another scenario where if someone is a potential flight risk and you want them to act on it, you don't want them to be getting aware, to be made aware of it. You keep that sort of thing confidential. So there are, of course, many instances where keeping things confidential are important to the business of the state. But here, clearly the court has said, well, it's this statute. We can't see why in the replying affidavits of the president and indeed of the DA that these things shouldn't be made open and available to the public. And I think if you think of the counter to that, had it not been public, anyone would have been open to going, you see, government's trying to hide something here by having it a secret affidavit. They don't want us to know about this. They're in league with the Russians or they're in league with the CIA, So having things confidential in this particular context really would have fed conspiracy theories and would have fed people about not knowing what's going on. Now we can see the arguments. We can go, this works, this doesn't work, and we can make our minds up accordingly.
I don't know if you've had a chance to look through the affidavit. I've been able to glance at it very briefly, so I might well have missed it. I see very little that would need to be kept confidential. Do we need to be careful about governments everywhere looking for any kind of excuse to keep something confidential, and therefore always be, I suppose, sort of on our guard?
I think we do need to be. I think often the default is to try and use that, and certainly in some of the cases we've seen, particularly the security agencies like to deem everything as confidential and in the national interest, when clearly many of the things that it says should be aren't. And there's a default position for them to do so, which is also why we need to push back as the public and say, if there are things that need to be kept confidential, give it to the court, let them decide. Let them say, yes, this justifies an appropriate limitation on the right of open justice, such that we agree it needs to be kept confidential. But certainly, as you've seen, on the basis of what's there, there's no reason to suggest why it should be, and now people can go and read it and make their minds up. Again, it's not to suggest that the presidency was acting in bad faith here, because there is that section in the Rome Statute that says it needs to be confidential. So, we have to balance these things. But again, it shows our justice system works. It shows this is the importance of why you have the principle of open justice anyway.
William Bird, thank you very much indeed from Media Monitoring Africa. I do appreciate the time tonight.